All right, everyone, settle down. Welcome to Advanced Calculus 301. Professor Richard Lancaster's voice cut through the buzz of conversation like a knife. The large lecture hall at Westfield University gradually fell silent as the renowned mathematician surveyed his new class with cold, calculating eyes. Marcus Johnson slid into a seat in the third row, arranging his perfectly organized notebooks on the desk. He'd been waiting for this class all summer. As a sophomore, who had tested out of several prerequisite courses, he was one of the youngest students in the room and one of only 3 black students in the hall of over 100. For those who don't know me, Professor Lancaster continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, I've been teaching calculus at this university for 27 years. I've written 4 textbooks, published 38 papers, and I do not tolerate mediocrity. A collective tension settled over the room. Lancaster's reputation preceded him brilliant but merciless, especially during his infamous opening day challenges designed to weed out students he deemed unworthy. Before we begin, let me be clear, 30% of you will not make it to the final exam. Another 40% will barely pass. If that frightens you, the door is right there, he gestured dismissively toward the exit. Marcus gripped his pencil tighter. He'd heard the stories about Lancaster, but he hadn't come this far to be intimidated. Growing up in Southside Chicago, he'd fought for every educational opportunity, staying up late working through math textbooks under the flickering light of his apartment while his mother worked double shifts. Mathematics wasn't just a subject for Marcus, it was a sanctuary, a language that made sense when the world didn't. Let's see what we're working with, Lancaster announced, picking up a piece of chalk. I'd like someone to solve this problem. With quick, precise strokes, he filled the blackboard with a complex differential equation that appeared well beyond first-day material. The room fell so quiet that the scratch of chalk seemed deafening. Any volunteers? Lancaster's thin smile suggested he expected none. Marcus studied the equation, his mind quickly breaking it apart, recognizing the pattern within. His hand twitched, wanting to rise, but years of experience held it down. Being too eager had made him a target before. No one. Lancaster's eyebrows raised in mock surprise. I thought this was advanced calculus. Several students shifted uncomfortably. A girl in the front row tentatively raised her hand, then lowered it when Lancaster's gaze fell on her. That's when Lancaster's eyes locked on Marcus. You, in the blue shirt. Lancaster pointed directly at Marcus. Since you've been scribbling in your notebook so confidently, perhaps you'd like to enlighten us. All heads turned toward Marcus, whose stomach tightened. He hadn't been scribbling solutions, he'd been taking notes on Lancaster's introduction. But now, 100 pairs of eyes were watching, waiting for him to fail. Your name? Lancaster demanded. Marcus Johnson, sir. Well, Mr. Johnson, the board awaits. Unless you prefer to reconsider your course selection. The challenge hung in the air. Marcus knew what this was, he'd faced it his entire academic life. The assumption that he didn't belong, that his presence was a mistake, a product of lowered standards rather than earned merit. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stood up and walked toward the board. The chalk felt cool and familiar in Marcus's fingers as he approached the imposing equation. He could feel Lancaster's eyes boring into his back, the weight of the entire class's attention pressing down on him. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he made a mistake? What if his mind went blank under pressure? We don't have all day, Mr. Johnson, Lancaster said, checking his watch with exaggerated impatience. Marcus took a deep breath and let the numbers speak to him. The equation was complex, yes, but there was an elegance to it that called to him. He began to write, his movements deliberate and precise. I'll start by applying the chain rule here, Marcus explained, his voice gaining confidence with each stroke of chalk. Then we'll need to use integration by parts, but there's a substitution we can make first to simplify. Lancaster crossed his arms, his expression morphing from smug certainty to mild surprise as Marcus worked through the problem methodically, narrating his thought process with clarity that even the confused first-day students could follow. And finally Marcus said, underlining his answer with a flourish, we get this result. The classroom remained silent. Marcus turned to face Lancaster, whose lips had pressed into a thin line. That's correct, Lancaster admitted, though he immediately added, but you took a rather roundabout approach. There's a more elegant solution. Actually, Marcus replied before he could stop himself, there are 3 ways to solve this particular problem. I chose this method because it's more intuitive for visualizing the geometric interpretation. He gestured to the small graph he'd sketched in the corner of the board. A few students gasped. No one challenged Lancaster. The professor's face tightened. Return to your seat, Mr. Johnson. One correct answer doesn't make a mathematician. As Marcus walked back, Lancaster erased his work with aggressive strokes and continued the lecture. For the next 2 weeks, Lancaster seemed determined to expose Marcus as a fraud. He'd call on him repeatedly, presenting increasingly difficult problems, interrupting his answers, and questioning his methods. Each time, Marcus rose to the challenge, though the constant pressure was taking its toll. He's targeting you, whispered Aisha, another black student in the class who had become Marcus's friend. Everyone can see it. I'm used to it, Marcus replied, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. You shouldn't have to be, Aisha said firmly. What Lancaster didn't know was that mathematics had been Marcus's refuge since childhood. His father, before passing away when Marcus was 9, had been a high school math teacher who recognized his son's gift early. On weekends, they would sit together solving puzzles and equations, his father patiently explaining concepts far beyond Marcus's grade level. Math doesn't care about who you are or where you come from, his father had told him. It only cares about the truth of your solution. After his father's death, Marcus clung to those words and those numbers. When his mother couldn't afford tutoring, he taught himself, devouring books from the public library. By 13, he was working through college-level material. By 16, he'd won a state mathematics competition that helped secure his scholarship to Westfield. None of this was evident from looking at him, a quiet young man in worn jeans and carefully maintained sneakers, working part-time at the campus bookstore to send money home to his mother. All Lancaster saw was someone who didn't fit his image of mathematical brilliance. The breaking point came 3 weeks into the semester during a discussion of original approaches to calculus problems. Innovation comes from understanding the foundations laid by the masters, Lancaster was saying. Newton, Leibniz, Euler, these are the shoulders upon which all modern mathematics stands. Marcus raised his hand, something he rarely did voluntarily anymore. Lancaster's eye twitched slightly. Yes, Mr. Johnson. I was wondering if we could also discuss non-Western mathematical traditions, Marcus said. The work of someone like Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose work on algebra. This is a calculus class, not a history of mathematics survey. Lancaster cut him off. Let's stick to relevant material. But it is relevant, Marcus persisted. Different cultural approaches to mathematics can inform how we think about problem solving today. There's research suggesting that. Mr. Johnson, Lancaster's voice turned icy. If you're so eager to lecture, perhaps you'd like to solve today's challenge problem on the board. It's from last year's International Mathematical Olympiad. None of my students have solved it yet. The class held its collective breath as Lancaster wrote out a fiendishly complex problem involving advanced integration techniques. Marcus studied it carefully. It was indeed challenging, but not impossible. As he worked through it on the board, he could feel Lancaster hovering nearby, waiting for a misstep. You've made an error, Lancaster interrupted, pointing to a step in the middle of Marcus's work. Marcus reviewed his calculations. No, sir, I don't believe I have. Are you contradicting me? Mr. Johnson, Lancaster's voice rose slightly. I'm just confirming my work is correct, Marcus replied evenly. Your substitution is invalid. With respect, Professor, the substitution works because of the symmetry property I identified earlier. Marcus pointed to his previous steps. The tension in the room was palpable as student eyes bounced between the young man and the increasingly agitated professor. Finish the problem, then Lancaster said with a dismissive wave. Marcus did, arriving at an elegant solution that filled half the board with meticulous calculations. When he put down the chalk, there was a moment of silence before several students began to nod in appreciation of the mathematical journey they'd just witnessed. Lancaster stared at the board, searching for flaws. Finding none, he simply said, "That will do," and continued the lecture without acknowledging Marcus's achievement. Later that day, Marcus received an email requesting he come to Lancaster's office hours the following morning. Marcus knocked on the heavy wooden door of Lancaster's office, his stomach knotted with tension. He'd barely slept, wondering what this meeting would entail. Enter came the clipped response. Professor Lancaster sat behind a desk covered in stacks of academic journals and mathematical texts. The walls were lined with awards, degrees and photographs of Lancaster with various distinguished mathematicians. "Sit down, Mr. Johnson." Marcus took the chair opposite the desk, his posture straight despite his exhaustion. "I've been reviewing your work," Lancaster began, holding up a folder containing Marcus's recent assignments. "Your solutions are unorthodox." "Is there a problem with them?" Marcus asked carefully. "They're correct," Lancaster admitted reluctantly. "But your methods suggest a lack of formal training. They're intuitive rather than rigorous." Marcus bit back a defensive response. His lack of formal training was due to circumstances beyond his control. Not everyone had access to elite prep schools and private tutors. "Mathematics isn't about intuition, Mr. Johnson. It's about discipline, rigor, and respect for established methods." Lancaster removed his glasses, polishing them slowly. "I'm concerned you're not taking this course seriously enough." "I've completed every assignment correctly and participated in every discussion," Marcus replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Yes, and you seem quite eager to challenge my teaching at every turn." "That wasn't my intention." Lancaster raised a hand to silence him. "I've been teaching longer than you've been alive. I've seen students like you before, naturally talented but undisciplined. Your kind of raw ability without proper guidance often leads to academic arrogance." "My kind," Marcus repeated, the phrase landing like a slap. Lancaster continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I'm assigning you an additional project. A proof that I've been working on myself. Consider it an opportunity to demonstrate whether you truly belong in this course." He handed Marcus several dense pages of mathematical notation. "You have 2 weeks, and I expect original work, not something cobbled together from online resources." Marcus scanned the first page, immediately recognizing that this was far beyond the scope of their current coursework. This wasn't an opportunity, it was a trap designed to prove Lancaster's predetermined conclusion that Marcus didn't belong. "May I ask why I'm the only student receiving this opportunity?" Marcus asked, choosing his words carefully. Lancaster's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Consider it a privilege, Mr. Johnson, unless you don't feel up to the challenge." The implication was clear, and it struck at a lifetime of similar insinuations. Marcus took the papers, thanked the professor with forced politeness, and left. Outside, he leaned against the corridor wall, closing his eyes briefly to center himself. The hallway was empty except for a woman organizing papers on a bulletin board further down. "Rough meeting?" she asked, noticing his expression. Marcus straightened up. "Just a challenging assignment." She walked closer, and he recognized Dr. Catherine Chen, the department chair whose photograph was displayed prominently on the mathematics department website. "From Professor Lancaster?" she asked, nodding toward the office Marcus had just left. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to complain but also struggling under the weight of weeks of targeted treatment. "It's all right," Dr. Chen said gently. "Richard has strong opinions about education." "It's a special assignment," Marcus finally said, showing her the pages. "Just for me." Dr. Chen frowned as she scanned the contents. "This is graduate-level work, partial differential equations with variable coefficients. This isn't part of the undergraduate curriculum." He said, "It's to determine if I belong in the class. Despite your grades." "I've submitted all the work correctly," Marcus confirmed. Dr. Chen's expression grew troubled. "Would you mind coming to my office? I'd like to hear more about your experience in Professor Lancaster's class." In Dr. Chen's warmly lit office, Marcus finally shared the full story, the consistent singling out, the dismissal of his correct answers, the thinly veiled implications about his qualifications. "I don't want special treatment," Marcus explained. "I just want a fair chance." Dr. Chen listened attentively, occasionally making notes. "Marcus, are you familiar with Dr. William Clayborne's work?" Marcus's eyes widened. "The topologist?" "Of course. His papers on geometric analysis are groundbreaking. He's giving a guest lecture tomorrow on campus. I think you should attend and bring your solution to this." She tapped Lancaster's assignment. "But I haven't solved it yet. Work on it tonight. Come by my office before the lecture. I want to see your approach." Marcus spent the entire night working through Lancaster's problem, filling his whiteboard with calculations, erasing and rewriting as new insights emerged. By morning, he had a solution he believed was correct, though it used techniques he'd taught himself rather than conventional methods. When he showed Dr. Chen his work that afternoon, her eyebrows rose progressively higher as she followed his reasoning. "This is remarkable, Marcus. You've approached it from a completely novel angle." "Is it wrong?" he asked anxiously. "No, it's elegant, and it shows a deep intuitive understanding of the underlying principles." She checked her watch. "The lecture starts in 20 minutes. Bring your notes." The lecture hall was packed when Marcus arrived with Dr. Chen. Professor Lancaster was in the front row, engaged in conversation with a distinguished-looking older man whom Marcus immediately recognized as Dr. William Clayborne, the celebrated mathematician whose textbooks had been Marcus's nighttime companions for years. Richard. Dr. Chen called as they approached. "I'd like you to properly meet one of your students, Marcus Johnson." Lancaster turned, his expression cooling when he saw Marcus. "We're well acquainted." "Marcus has been working on an interesting problem," Dr. Chen continued, undeterred. "Dr. Clayborne, would you mind taking a look?" Before Lancaster could object, Dr. Chen handed Marcus's solution to Clayborne, who adjusted his glasses and began to read. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as his eyes moved across the pages, occasionally returning to earlier sections, his expression unreadable. "Where did you get this problem?" he finally asked, looking up at Marcus. "Professor Lancaster assigned it to me yesterday," Marcus replied. As extra credit, Lancaster added quickly. "Mr. Johnson has been eager for additional challenges." Dr. Clayborne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Richard, this is part of the research I've been working on for the past year." A murmur ran through the small group that had gathered around them. Young man, Clayborne addressed Marcus directly. "Your approach here is fascinating. You've established a connection between these two principles that I've been attempting to reconcile for months." Lancaster's face paled. "That's impossible. He must have found your paper online." "But my work on this isn't published yet," Clayborne interrupted, "and his solution takes a completely different path than mine." "One I hadn't considered." He turned back to Marcus. "Where did you learn to think this way?" All eyes were on Marcus, who suddenly felt the weight of his journey, the late nights with only textbooks for company, the problems worked out on scrap paper during bus rides, the competitions entered despite having no coach, the constant need to prove himself worthy of the space he occupied. "My father was a math teacher," he said simply. "He taught me that math was a conversation, not just a set of rules. When he passed away, I kept that conversation going through books and problems. I taught myself what I couldn't access otherwise." Clayborne nodded slowly, looking between Marcus and Lancaster. "Richard, I believe I'd like this young man to assist with the project I was planning to discuss with your department. His perspective would be invaluable." Lancaster's mouth opened and closed, no words emerging. "In fact," Clayborne continued, warming to the idea, "if you're interested, Marcus, I have a summer research position that would be perfect for someone with your creative approach to problem solving." The lecture that followed was a blur for Marcus. As Dr. Clayborne presented his work, he repeatedly referenced an interesting alternative approach and displayed some of Marcus's calculations, crediting him by name in front of the entire department. Afterward, as the audience dispersed, Lancaster approached Marcus, his usual confidence notably diminished. "I may have misjudged your potential, Mr. Johnson," he said stiffly. "Your additional assignment is no longer necessary." "Thank you," Professor Marcus replied, "but I'd like to complete it anyway. I found it quite illuminating." Lancaster nodded curtly and walked away. Dr. Chen squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "That took courage, all of it. Standing your ground these past weeks, working through that problem, facing him today." "I almost dropped the class a dozen times," Marcus admitted. "I'm glad you didn't. Mathematics needs diverse perspectives, not just to fulfill quotas or statistics, but because the field itself benefits from different ways of thinking, different life experiences informing how we approach problems." As the hall emptied, Dr. Clayborne approached again, handing Marcus his card. "I meant what I said about that research position. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted or discouraged." The last words were directed at Lancaster's retreating back. The next day in class, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted Marcus warmly. The whispers that followed him had transformed from skeptical to admiring. Professor Lancaster, however, remained unchanged in many ways. He still called on Marcus frequently, still scrutinized his work carefully, but there was a new undertone of grudging respect in his interactions. After class, Marcus was surprised when Lancaster asked him to stay behind. "You've made quite an impression on Dr. Clayborne," Lancaster said, organizing papers on his desk without looking up. "His work has been influential for me," Marcus replied neutrally. Lancaster finally met his gaze. "I've been teaching for nearly 3 decades, Mr. Johnson. In that time, I've developed certain expectations about how mathematical talent manifests." Marcus remained silent, waiting. "Those expectations have occasionally been proven wrong, but rarely as dramatically as you've demonstrated." Lancaster's admission seemed physically painful for him. "Your methods are unorthodox, but I cannot deny their effectiveness." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Lancaster said sharply. "I haven't done you any favors." "No," Marcus agreed, "you haven't." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Why did you stay in my class?" Lancaster finally asked. "After how I treated you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because I belong here," he said simply, "and leaving would have confirmed what you wanted to believe." Lancaster flinched slightly at the directness of the answer. "Well," he said after a moment, "I suppose we both learned something this semester." But it wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement. For now, that would have to be enough. The real change, however, came from his fellow students. Word of his encounter with Dr. Clayborne had spread, and suddenly Marcus found himself surrounded by peers who wanted to study with him, to understand his approach to problems, to learn from his perspective. "You should start a study group," Aisha suggested as they left class one day. Half the class would show up. "I'm not a teacher," Marcus protested. "You explained partial derivatives better than Lancaster did," another classmate chimed in. "I actually understood it for the first time." Reluctantly, Marcus agreed to host a weekly study session in the library. The first meeting, he expected 5 or 6 people. 15 showed up. By the third session, they had to move to a larger room to accommodate everyone. Marcus discovered something surprising: he loved teaching. Explaining concepts, watching understanding dawn on someone's face, finding different ways to illuminate an idea, it reminded him of weekend mornings with his father, the pure joy of shared discovery. At the end of the semester, Marcus received an unexpected email from Dr. Chen. Dr. Clayborne's research position had been formally approved, with funding for 2 years. Additionally, she was offering Marcus a teaching assistantship for the following year. "Your gifts extend beyond solving equations," she wrote. "You have a rare ability to make mathematics accessible without simplifying its beauty. We need more educators with that talent." Marcus sat in his dorm room, reading the email again and again. He thought of his father, who had believed in his potential when no one else did. He thought of all the moments he'd almost given up, all the times he'd been made to feel he didn't belong in academic spaces. Picking up his phone, he called his mother with the news. "He always said you were going to change things," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father knew." "I miss him," Marcus said quietly. "He's with you in every equation you solve, every student you help," she replied. "That's how love works. It multiplies, divides, but never diminishes." On the last day of class, Professor Lancaster returned their final exams. He placed Marcus's paper on his desk without comment, but Marcus noticed something written at the top in red ink beside his perfect score approach: unconventional, but illuminating. Consider publishing. As students filed out of the lecture hall for the last time, Marcus lingered, looking around the room that had been the site of so many challenges and, ultimately, triumphs. Lancaster was erasing the board, his back to the emptying classroom. Without turning, he said, "I'll be interested to see what you accomplish, Mr. Johnson." Marcus nodded, though Lancaster couldn't see him. "Thank you for the education, Professor, in more ways than one." Outside, the spring sunshine warmed Marcus's face as he walked across the campus quad. His phone buzzed with messages from study group members thanking him for his help throughout the semester. One of them had written, "You made me believe I could actually do this." Marcus smiled, thinking of all the young people like himself, brilliant minds from unexpected places, fighting twice as hard for half the recognition. Perhaps his journey could help light the way for others. Perhaps that was the most elegant solution of all. the world of mathematics, like the world at large, was gradually changing, and Marcus Johnson, once underestimated, would be part of that transformation, one equation at a time,